We have finally done it. We finally finished at least this first round of exploration of games set during the Age of Enlightenment, war games specifically, all of them tactical or grand tactical battles of the era. And I thought it was finally time to do a compare and contrast of each of these titles. I did throw in Horse and Musket in here because I do think there is some detail around this system worth talking about in relation to the rest. So if you've been following my channel for the last couple months, you've seen me do playthroughs of all of these games in one form or another. I've enjoyed playing them. It's been very fun. It's really stoked my interest in the historical period. But I think now we need to compare and contrast all of these 6 games. And I think we need to do it in sort of a comparing and contrasting their historical modeling, let's say, in some 3 different criteria that I feel like, to me, would be the most important when I'm looking at Tactical Age of Reason, in terms of like what the game is reflecting historically. So those 3 criteria are going to be, number 1 is going to be tactical fire doctrine. So the way that the systems here use fire combat and reflect historical fire combat of the period. Number 2 is going to be the role of cavalry on the battlefield as it relates to other cavalry, as it relates to the organization of the army, and as it relates to the interaction between cavalry and infantry. And the third and final criteria that I want to look at these 3 games is going to be linear maneuver and linear formational deployment, let's say, because that is really why we started looking at this. This is the age of linear warfare, and all of these games do different things to sort of reflect the static linear formations of the period. So let's start at the top with number 1, and that is fire combat and tactical doctrine. So when it comes to fire combat and tactical doctrine around ranged fire, the games are roughly divided into 2 camps. On the left side here, we have what I'm going to call a simplified fire system that really is kind of general in terms of what it's portraying. As we saw in the Battle of Camposanto, it is fire and melee are kind of all combined into one die roll, and that die roll, like most war games, just kind of abstractly represents the combat that is happening. So there's not a lot of detail in the combat system here. Horse and Musket is very similar, but also different. So Horse and Musket, you don't have a variety of results from like your fire combat. And again, the fire combat here is just a simple die roll, and it's either going to cause, I believe, a hit, which is going to lower the morale of the enemy unit, or it's going to miss. And if you're playing with optional rules, it's going to force you potentially to retreat if you critically miss. So kind of abstractly representing the exchange of volleys. Neither of these 2 games really show sort of the drilled training that the troops of the era had, which was they would fire in initial volleys. That's why you had linear formations. You were trying to mass musketry fire all in one go against the enemy. And that initial volley was really critical in terms of like opening the engagement when you're standing opposite another line of troops. And that first volley would be prepared before the battle in the muskets themselves, so that when you got to battle, they could be ordered to fire quickly. The Battle of Minden, which you've seen most recently, uses fire combat. The role of fire combat in this system is actually quite interesting. It's actually downplayed somewhat, it's kind of confusing. I would say it's maybe a little bit antithetical to the modern understanding of linear warfare, but there are probably reasons it was designed this way, so I don't want to say the designer did it wrong. I just find that for me, it was very strange. So first of all, fire combat in this game is done on 1 unit per 1 unit basis, which is the same as Horse and Musket, but Horse and Musket, one player takes all of their actions, and then the other player does all their actions. So it's kind of abstracting away the interaction between lines of troops. The same is true of Camposanto. In the Battle of Minden, when you choose to fire, you choose a unit, they fire, and then your opponent chooses a unit and then fires. Now, there is a rule about going left to right or right to left across the formations that are engaging in fire combat, but you never really get the sense that there are these mass volleys happening. Now, this could be something that's slightly different in the 7 Years' War as compared to the War of Austrian Succession, but it is the biggest outlier of all of these games. The fire combat system in the 7 Years' War battle system feels much more precise than you would expect to see with sort of massed volleys. The other thing that's interesting about Minden is that unlike other games that we would look at, you have to make a effectiveness check or a morale check against your units in order to do a fire combat. But you don't have to do it when you make a melee combat, which is quite interesting. Here, morale checks are part of the defender when you do a melee combat. So the melee and fire combat are separated into two separate actions in these two games. But in this one, fire combat is more difficult than melee combat, which is quite a big difference and departure from another game that we played. And that is these three, and that is Piacenza. And that's part of these three games over here. And these I would consider... for fire combat, I would consider them much more focused on the volley or the firepower being sort of combined like across the formation all at once, right? Like the simultaneous exchange of massed volleys. So when we look at the battles of Louis XIV from Via Victus, Hochstadt, and Speyerbach, again, we have ranged fire and melee separated. Ranged fire in this system is simultaneous between units, and that is something that is common as well with Piacenza. And you use a fire table to determine what happens when you engage in fire. And typically that will either mean a morale check or a... I forget, it's been a while since I played it, but I think D is a demoralization level. So you can, and it's not based on the combat values of the units. So when you fire, you're trying to inflict retreats or demoralization on the enemy, and it is simultaneous. So when you choose a unit to fire at, they get to fire at you at the same time. That, to me, is much more representative of volley exchanges across linear formations. Now, what's interesting about this game and Piacenza together is they both take into account, and actually Blenheim as well to a lesser extent, they both take into account the types of drilling, the types of training that the troops have. So we've got fire by platoon and we've got fire by line. And Blenheim goes into this a lot more. Different formations in Blenheim have the same thing, fire by platoon or fire in line. But different effects based on the training levels of the units or the training discipline of the units based on whether they were taught to fire as line infantry or fire by platoons and so forth. So these two games I would consider sort of formation-based fire systems that are this one is simultaneous. Blenheim is not simultaneous, although there is an abstraction of simultaneous fire in this one in a interesting way that happens at the end of a round of the game. But in general, these two systems are focused on the formations and drilling of the units to do simultaneous fire and how that affects the enemy. And then we come to Piacenza, which in my view, I think is probably my favorite of all of the games here in terms of modeling fire combat. I really do like Blenheim's as well, and I do like the formation, like platoon versus fire by line versus pistoliers and so forth in these other games. But Piacenza's fire system is a little bit more interesting. So when we're talking about like fire combat, you're engaging with a die roll, and it's based on the number of battalions that are essentially firing. So for example, the combat values on these counters represent the number of battalions that are in each of these units in a specific area in the game. The more battalions that you mass in a hex, the greater your firepower is going to be. But what's interesting is that based on who you are targeting, that may be shifted. So if you're a big battalion firing, or a big brigade firing on another big brigade, both of those fires, which are again simultaneous, very similar here to the Via Victus model, are going to be affected negatively because you've got large amounts of firepower going against one another, but because there's more manpower in the hex, the fire effectiveness is going to be less. And further on top of that, Piacenza, as you saw in my playthrough, has sort of the ranks filling in from the back system here. So sometimes when you are hit in combat, you go into a reforming state. And that takes into effect, it's an abstraction, it takes into effect the idea that as the front ranks fall to fire, ranks in the rear move forward. And counterintuitively, the bigger your unit is, the bigger your brigade, the more battalions, the more likely it is that you'll be able to refill that manpower on the front line quicker, keeping you in combat longer. And so I really like this model here. The designer really did his research on the ins and outs of fire combat for this era, and I think that Piacenza really shows it the best in my view. I thought the fire combat system here is really interesting. On top of that, you can do multiple volleys on a turn, but there's a chance that on your second volley, you go into an uncontrolled fire at will state. which has a whole host of effects, but basically neutralizes your unit. And so you kind of lose the discipline and training that these troops were taught to fire with if you get too aggressive, or you give, too offensive an order, or you get, confused or whatever. So I really like the fire system in Piacenza. It is, again, simultaneous back and forth. So when you choose to fire, your opponent fires back at you at the same way. And with multiple rounds in a single combat of volleys, I really do think that Piacenza was the best game in these 6 games that I played at modeling Age of Reason fire combat with massed volleys and the exchange of fire through linear formations. So it's not a competition. I'm just doing this as an analysis, but if we were keeping score, Piacenza wins criteria 1, and that is the implementation and design of ranged combat in this era. So let's go to number 2, and that is the role of cavalry on the battlefield. All right, when we're talking about cavalry on the battlefield, we are going to separate this into 3 different groups where the games are somewhat similar. So in the Age of Reason, cavalry was not the powerful force that it was in the Napoleonic era. We were getting towards that point, and each of the games takes a different approach to cavalry. So here on the right, we'll start with these 2 games. We've got the Battles of Louis XIV from Via Victis, and we've got the Battle of Camposanto from Parabellum magazine. So both of these games are fairly liberal with their interpretation of cavalry. The Battles of Louis XIV, cavalry is very powerful. Cavalry can attack infantry. Cavalry get a lot of bonuses from charging, as you can see here on the combat table, as we looked at in my my playthrough, but you can see that heavy cavalry gets bonuses against other types of units. Again, we're using a formation system here, so you've got pistolier cavalry as well, and shock combat between units is possible no matter what type of unit they are. And it typically, I found as I was playing this, that cavalry were very, very effective. Maybe more akin to Napoleonic era cavalry than maybe is warranted for this era. So I would say that the Via Victis series definitely had the most powerful cavalry and the least limitations on how you could use your cavalry. In fact, most of the battles came down to the cavalry being the deciding factor, which to me doesn't quite track historically when I look at some of these battles and whatnot. And obviously, it's interesting that the cover of this game has cavalry front and center. So if you like a cavalry-heavy game, you may, and you like this era, you may look at this because you have a lot of freedom and flexibility with your cavalry. Now, the same is somewhat similar for Camposanto as well. And again, we're having a lot of free-flowing cavalry. There's not a lot of restrictions. The real main interaction here is that cavalry are allowed to attack infantry, but if they do, they suffer a negative modifier on their die roll. So there's not really a consequence of using cavalry. You're just kind of disincentivized from using them against infantry if you have infantry in the area. So again, fairly liberal approach to cavalry, not a lot of special rules governing the way they interact with infantry. And Camposanto has a lot of cavalry in it, so you're getting a lot of cavalry on cavalry battles, but the resolution of the combat between them is not any different than the resolution against infantry. The game is very simple, and as you saw my playthrough, you would recognize that the rules are much more of a game than a simulation, but I wanted to include it here. Then we come to the second group here, and this is where cavalry gets a little bit more sophisticated, although still fairly liberal in terms of its application. So in Blenheim, cavalry are specific units, and there's stacking restrictions about whether or not you can have cavalry with infantry in a mega hex. Basically, if you remember the game, you've got these huge areas on the board. You can see these big mega hexes made up of multiple hexes. Cavalry can charge in this game, so you've got cavalry charges. You have that in the Via Victis system as well, but in Blenheim, the combat system is so unique and different that it's a little more abstract, I guess you would say. Now, like the infantry mechanic, Blenheim also uses different cavalry training doctrines for the different troops. So you've got pistolier cavalry, and then you've got actual charging cavalry. And there's a difference between the two and the modifiers. Because this is a modifier-based system, the cavalry interact differently depending on whose cavalry you're using in this game. You can attack cavalry, I believe can attack infantry in this game. I have to double check that actually. Yeah, you do have a charge and countercharge system in Blenheim, but cavalry can attack infantry. So they are not as good when doing that. There are modifiers that take against them. So they're very similar to Camposanto, but they can move faster, and they do feel somewhat different than the infantry. You're typically not going to be trying to hold positions defensively with cavalry in the Battle of Blenheim in this 7-hex system. And they're primarily they're better off focusing on other cavalry. So Blenheim has kind of a mix of things. There is some additional detail with cavalry, but it's not quite The simulation, as we're going to see in other games in this video. Horse and musket. Horse is in the title. Cavalry are one of the main units in the horse and musket system. Again, there's lots of optional rules that you can use in this system, which is very modular, to enhance the role of cavalry on the battlefield. But the one thing I will say is that cavalry units are one of the few units that can charge in this game. There's also a counter-charging system in this game, and there's also a morale and defensive fire system in this game as well. And so typically charging cavalry into infantry is a really bad idea. Now, so what that means is in horse and musket, the rules don't preclude you from having cavalry interact with infantry, but you are heavily disincentivized, even more so than in Blenheim or the other games that we've looked at. And in general, I think the cavalry feel really good in horse and musket. Again, it's a simple system. You're not getting a level of like simulation fidelity here, but the cavalry do feel different. In the Battle of Minden that you saw me play, I was very reluctant to have my cavalry charge fortified positions with the Dutch were occupying in that battle. And there's a reason for that, is because some of the things that can go wrong can go very badly. Defensive fire can be very, very devastating in this, so you definitely do not want to send your cavalry headlong into infantry. Now, cavalry versus cavalry is another topic in this game, and I think it actually does it quite well. You can charge cavalry. Cavalry can withdraw before combat if they're a specific type of cavalry. You've got dragoons in horse and musket, whereas you didn't have that. You do have dragoons in the Via Victis system, but the rules around them are pretty... like basically all you can do is change them out to be foot units or horse units. Here in horse and musket, dragoons, you don't have that option, but they behave differently than normal cavalry units, which is kind of cool. You've also got things like hussars, cuirassiers. There's different types of cavalry units in the horse and musket system, and they all do perform slightly differently in combat. And as you layer in those special rules, you do get to something more approaching the realistic view of the way cavalry interacted with infantry on the battlefield. Of note, I think every single game that I'm looking at here has cavalry front and center on the box cover. Here we've got Marlborough. Here we've got some officer on cavalry. We've got cavalry on the cover of Piacenza, and we've got cavalry here in the cover of Minden as well. Something I just noticed as I'm talking about this. So I would say horse and musket, probably a middle ground, maybe strays slightly more towards the simulation aspect than any of the three we've looked at yet. And that is the gradient that we go to as we move over to the final two games here that we're going to look at for the role of cavalry on the battlefield. And that is Minden, 7 Years' War battle system, and Piacenza. So let's start with Piacenza. Cavalry, very restrictive in what they can do. They can't openly charge infantry. They can only attack cavalry. When infantry gets close to them, they must retreat. And you saw that in the playthrough when the French sort of coming around the southern flank were pushing the Austrian cavalry back. There's no option to engage with cavalry against infantry here. You're not allowed to do it. So very restrictive rules around cavalry. And from my understanding of the era, that is much more in line with sort of the normal day-to-day of cavalry. Now, that's not to say there weren't cavalry charges against infantry. There definitely were, but it wasn't the Napoleonic hammer blow, right? They were trained differently. They were made up of different... They were lightly armored a lot of the time, unless you were like heavy cuirassiers. And in general, cavalry faced off against cavalry or were used to pursue after a battle or a combat. So Piacenza, I think, really kind of takes that to heart and makes a really strict doctrine around how cavalry are used in this system. You've also got dragoons in Piacenza, and you can exchange them between foot and horse units, and they behave like each of those units. So dragoons on foot behave more like infantry, even though there are some drawbacks to using them in a heavy firefight. And cavalry dragoons, light cavalry, they behave more like horse units and are sort of bound by all the restrictions that horse units have. So in general, I think Piacenza does a very detailed modeling of the way that cavalry operated on the battlefield, at least in this battle during the War of Austrian Succession. I didn't think it was particularly flavorful, other than the rules about interacting with infantry, but I do think it did a really solid job. And, the cavalry here was mainly used in sweeping maneuvers around the outside. Now, the 7 Years' War battle system, this is where I think the cavalry rules kind of have the most going on. So cavalry here can only charge other cavalry. If infantry charges cavalry, they must withdraw, very similar to Piacenza. And I think that is more the historical model here. So if cavalry is important to you in terms of historical place on the battlefield, these two games are going to be probably more closer to a historical reality than maybe some of the others. Cavalry here is... typically fairly light. They don't have the punching power that infantry charges do, but because you can only charge other cavalry, you're getting a lot of 50-50 coin tosses when you use them to do that, at least in the scenario that I played. They can move much faster, and they have... they still sort of abide by sort of the 7 Years' War battle system brigade multi-hex counter system, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, in general, the cavalry rules here are going to be very similar to what Piacenza had. And there's actually no fire combat with cavalry in either of these. So while we did see Pistolier cavalry in Blenheim, and we saw it in the Via Victis system, you don't have any, as far as I can remember, any ranged combat for your cavalry in these two games. The one thing I will note about the Seven Years' War battle system with cavalry as well is that there is a fairly comprehensive and in-depth charge and countercharge procedure here. Definitely by far the most complex cavalry charge stuff here. Cavalry units have zones of influence that they basically their line of sight that they can reach via movement, and that can determine whether they can charge or countercharge. And a lot of while horse and musket also has countercharges, and I believe Piacenza does as well, the most involved process here is going to be in 7 Years of War battle system. Additionally, a lot more command flexibility and movement flexibility for cavalry here than you see in other systems. Here, cavalry just have a longer range to stay in command. Here, cavalry units, when you're talking about moving your formations more efficiently with line formations, cavalry function differently than infantry, actually. So you see the way that cavalry squadrons would have lined up historically. Here, more so than you see in the other games. Part of that's the scale and the way that the counters are represented in the game, but also the mechanics. Cavalry must be formed in lines vertically, sort of like top to bottom on the hex grain, and if they can do that successfully, they can all move together, even if they're part of different brigades or commands, whereas infantry do it line by line, left to right, horizontally. So fairly sophisticated cavalry system here. I would say of the 6 games, the cavalry system that I enjoyed the most was probably 7 Years' War battle system. They really do feel like different units on the battlefield. And then after that, I think Piacenza does a fine job, even though they're fairly ineffective unless you're fighting other cavalry. And I think in horse and musket is a nice middle ground in terms of the role cavalry plays on the battlefield, along with the limitations of the era. So these two are my favorite, but I think the 7 Years' War battle system, despite the complexity and involved nature of the charge and countercharge, I think sort of does the best job in conveying the role of cavalry on the battlefield in this era. So now that we've looked at cavalry, let's go to the final criteria, and that is linear formations and maneuver. And this is, again, like I said, the big reason why we started looking at these games. How do these games represent linear warfare in terms of the way that soldiers maneuvered, and the way that formations operated, how they engaged in combat, and so forth? And again, we're going to break down the games in 3 different groups, starting with this group over here. We have got the Via Victis Battles of Louis XIV series. We've got Camposanto from Parabellum and Horse and Musket. All 3 of these games do feature elements of linear warfare, but they are usually bounded by some other mechanic in the game. There are no specific rules about keeping your formations linear or in historical shapes, let's call it. In Camposanto, it's really driven by the command and initiative system, which is those chits. If you watch my playthrough, you have a number of chits that are ranged 1 through 18. And every turn, you play those chits hidden against your opponent, and then based on who played the highest, the next highest, your different wings of the army are going to have different abilities or drawbacks to them. And there's no rule that says those wings need to stay together. However, there are incentives in the rules to keep your formations from being flanked, and that sort of lightly enforces a linear doctrine on your movement and whatnot, and your combat for that matter, because you don't want enemies to get into your flanks. You want to keep them in front of you. You want to keep a long line of troops, and you want to make sure that everyone's facing each other. Very similar here. Instead of being bounded by the initiative system, it's bounded by command and control. So your leaders, and staying in command under your leaders, because it's a leader activation system, you want to keep your formations kind of near your leader. There's no restrictions about being in line. They can be in any kind of shape that you want them to be. But again, there are combat incentives to keep your formations linear, and most of that involves flanking. Being flanked can be somewhat punitive here, especially if it's by artillery, or the outnumbered nature of having 2v1 engagements with different brigades and what have you. So both of these are fairly light on the linear doctrine of the era. They feel very vanilla. Maybe vanilla is not the right word. They feel more traditional hex and counter war game, old school, than the period would maybe suggest that there should be. So if you're looking for that, these aren't going to be the forefront of what these games' scope are about, the linear maneuver and tactics of the period. Horse and Musket, again, very similar to these 3, in that there is no specific rule about being in a line formation. However, when you do add things like facing into the system, then being flanked is extremely punishing. And so linear formations tend to emerge just naturally through the gameplay. However, I will say with Horse and Musket, because the size of the battlefield is always going to be a 13x9 hex grid, the emphasis of linear formations is both de-emphasized because you know that there's a finite level of battlefield anywhere you go, and also emphasized in the sense that, like, if you get flanked or surrounded on that small battlefield, it's usually going to be game over. So very abstract, much more abstract in Horse and Musket, but you can mitigate that somewhat with some of the optional rules, like facing and engagement. Specifically, I talked about this in my playthrough of near Minden with this system, about how you're sort of incentivized to keep your line. So all three of these I would describe as a simplistic or abstracted view of linear warfare and formations, and therefore are on the lighter end of the spectrum. We're going to come back to Blenheim because that's its own special child. Let's talk about the Battle of Minden and Piacenza. Both of these, again, are hex-based games. Both of these have specific rules enforcing linear formations. In the case of Piacenza, you must declare before you march on the hex grid where your line is going to be before you move any of your formation. So this is a formation activation game, and as we saw in the playthrough, terrain plays a big role in that. So before you move anyone in a formation, you declare where the line is going to be, then you move your units, and if they cross a terrain feature, they may have to roll for a cohesion test, essentially, to see if they actually make it to that position. And so the enforcing mechanism of line of linear doctrine and linear formation here is driven entirely by movement and terrain. And that is going to be where the big challenge comes in, is how do you get your army into a position to obey the line rules so that they may be effective in combat. If you remember, the Spanish up here had a really hard time with all of these ditches and gullies and entrenchments and stuff approaching the Austrian position because they couldn't comply by the line formation rules. Now, the one thing I will say about Piacenza is that the linear formation rules, as it relates to movement, are pretty abstract. In the sense that it's like really hard to tell what's going on. Why is a ditch causing you to just have some of your units not reach it? Why, if I have a unit of 4 battalions, why do all 4 battalions fail to cross the ditch? Maybe some battalions might and some battalions might not. So it's pretty abstract. You've really got to get a mental picture of what's going on based on what the mechanics are telling you, or at least fill in the gaps in your head. But it does make a really interesting game system because you just can't approach the enemy and attack like you would in a normal hex encounter game. You are kind of constrained by the terrain. The Spanish, who were trying to cross this river line and ditch line, the best that they could do was get a narrow line in here to face off against these Austrian entrenchments. So anywhere it was more open in the south, it was a lot easier. So Piacenza does a really interesting, creative way of enforcing line doctrine on the armies through its movement system. Now, with Minden, we have the same thing going on, but a completely different approach for how you do this. In Minden, if you haven't watched my playthrough, you'll know that every unit in the game has 3 counters. You've got each individual unit counter, and then each of the units also belongs, most of the time, to a brigade. And this brigade counter is a maneuver element of its own. So you can see that this brigade is the Shell Brigade, made up of 3 battalions here, coded with a number. And then each side of this counter has a formation. So you've got a linear, or sort of a column march formation on this side, as evidenced by the arrow, and this represents these 3 battalions being in line. Typically, you use this while you're on the march, on roads and whatnot, and this brigade must stay together because it's confined to the counter. There is no option. There is no sort of abstract, like, trying mental gymnastics to have to figure out why a unit is in line or how it's forming a line. Here, you are enforced because the pieces enforce the linear nature of the combat. So once you've moved your unit up, then you must turn it, and then you can flip it over into column, into line formation. And now all of these brigades are facing this way, and they're ready to fire. So there is the unit facing and counter makeup of the game enforce linear doctrine actually really creatively and in a way that I really, really like. In fact, it was my favorite part of this game was maneuvering the brigade units to get into a position, because it is difficult. It is slow, it is difficult, and really understanding the terrain and the activation system is the key to playing well. In addition to that, if you have multiple brigades in a line with at least, one hex between them, oftentimes in artillery, of different brigades. Now, these are the same brigade, but imagine they're different brigades. Then all of these brigades, when you go to activate your leader through the command system, you can move them all together because they formed a unified front. And with cavalry, it's the opposite. Cavalry, it's like this, and there's a hex row between them. Then all of them can move. So while there are not rules restricting your ability to have linear formations, you can position your counters however you want. And in fact, in my playthrough, you saw that we got a little bit bendy trying to confront the Anglo-Allied threat with my brigades, or, some of them were overlapping like this. What's nice about the game system is that it rewards linear formation through incentives. If you can form your different commands into a singular large line, then you can move them all together, and your activations are much more efficient. You can do combat with multiple commands and the same impulse, while your opponent may be struggling one at a time to get his brigades. And so because you're confined by the counters, and because you're because you're incentivized by the movement rules, I actually think that Minden has the best linear formation system of any of these games. It's creative, it's interesting, it makes you think in a different way that you're not used to, and it does expose the limitations that linear warfare had on the way that you can engage the enemy. But it's important to get it right because your enemy has to do the exact same thing. There's also some differences for the Prussians in this system, as you would expect, since they had things like oblique formations and stuff like that. We didn't really get into that in the playthrough, but I think this is genius. I think the idea that the brigade is all together in formation and they must move together, and you have to be conscious of how you move them, because if they approach and then go to the right, you can see that they're all now facing backwards when they go to line formation, means the maneuver is a huge part of the battle system, which is not typical of battle games, but what I really liked here was that maneuver played such an essential element. Getting your formations to the spot you need them to be and in a position to fight effectively is a big part of being good at the game, and it's probably the best part of the game, to be perfectly honest with you. You can go see my gripes about the rest of this playthrough that I did in that video, but the best thing about the game was the way that linear formations are enforced by the pieces and by the incentives to be more efficient with your actions. And the other thing I would say here is that line formation is also once these brigades take some hits, each of these units in the brigade has its own counter that will then come out of this brigade. And eventually, if you lose more than 50%, the brigade marker goes away and you're left with 3 single units. So you really get a feel of how an army might be in a very solid linear formation to start an engagement. And by the end of the engagement, it's become very chaotic and undisciplined, and the constitution of the brigades disintegrates. And I think that was just such a great representation of the period with this system, and easily its best quality. So when we're talking about linear warfare, I do think that 7 Years' War battle system has the most interesting and probably, I don't want to say accurate, but most compelling to me. In terms of enforcing the way that armies moved and fought in formation for the period. I also think Piacenza does a really good job. I just think it's a more abstract than here. Here you can clearly see what's going on the table. Here you've got to do a little bit of theater of the mind as you're moving to get a sense of that. And obviously with the other ones, we're talking about a later experience. Except for Blenheim, which I told you we'd come back to. All right, Blenheim, 7-hex system. If you did not watch my playthrough, I'm going to try and explain this as quickly to you as possible, but I highly recommend you go check it out because I go on at length about the ways that these sort of like the 7-hex system is named because there are 7 hexes and sort of these mega hex areas sort of enforce linear formation. It is a extremely novel way to approach this problem, but essentially what happens is each of these areas has a stacking limit, and you can have units in these areas. They can either be in a bordering hex facing another, one of these individual hexes in this area facing another major area, or they can be in the center. And based on the positioning of your units, that is going to enforce some specific abilities for them. So if you're in the center hex of an area, that means you're ready to attack. You can attack into adjacent mega hexes, and that is what that indicates. If your units are in the bordering hexes, they cannot attack. They first have to move back to the center before they can move to another mega hex. However, when you're in the border hexes, you are basically supposed to be in a defensive orientation, and you are much better at protecting and holding ground, even though you can't attack. So if someone attacks you, it's a lot harder to dislodge you. And so you have this really interesting decision space where you're trying to get your units to be most efficient in terms of realizing your goals. So let's say we're trying to attack this town of Sonderheim. I probably want to get as many units in these different mega hexes in the middle so that I can make multiple attacks on the town. Because the linearity here is being enforced by the areas, not the hexes the units are in. Very counterintuitive. Units that are defending in these two hexes, for example, and the units that are in the center here, and maybe units that are in the center here, because all three of these are adjacent, you're going to get different modifier bonuses on your attack and defense rolls based on where you're attacked or based on where you are attacking. And in general, the system rewards you from having contiguous lines of areas with your units in them in various formations versus leaving these open. So while playing the game, it doesn't look linear, the game mechanics are representing linearity in a really novel way based on control of space and projection of force. It's unlike anything else I've ever played, and it will work for some people, and it will not work for other people. Again, if you have problems with highly abstracted systems, then this is not going to probably be satisfying for you. But if you understand linear warfare and can see what the game is representing, then this is one that's a really interesting, unique take. It's nowhere near as complex as Piacenza and Minden, but it does bring its own special blend of realizing linear doctrine and linear formations in a way that no other game here that we're looking at does. And in fact, I would argue that unlike any other tactical war game really does, for that matter. So if you're looking for something that's not trying to fit into the mold of existing wargame paradigms, of hex and counter wargame paradigms, Blenheim might be the one for you to look at to get your linear combat fix, simply because it is creative and novel and so outside the box. If that's problematic for you, then you may want to look at something like Piacenza or Minden if you want something really detailed, or if you don't, you would look at the other ones that we talked about. Of them all, I think Minden is my favorite, but I do really respect what Blenheim was doing here in this particular criteria for it. So in conclusion, we have looked at 6 games that represent the 18th century and the style of warfare of the time throughout many different conflicts. War of Austrian Succession, War of Spanish Succession, 7 Years' War, War of Spanish Succession, War of Austrian Succession, and every era, really. I hope that this was helpful in sort of showing you other games from this period that are not Battles from the Age of Reason. Now, I haven't played Battles of the Age of Reason, so I don't know how these compares, but I believe there will be a part 2 of this kind of video once I do get Bar to the table and learn it, and I can do an accurate compare and contrast to other systems and possibly other games that come out from this era. There are many that I haven't played. There are many more that I would like to play, and I would like to see how they model it. These are just 6 that I had in my collection that I was interested in, and I felt like a video was necessary. The ultimate question I think you may be asking is, so which one do I recommend? If you had to start somewhere, or you are already a fan of this era, which is the most historically accurate? Which one is the best? I don't know that I can answer that because I have my preferences, and different pieces of these different games I actually like better than others. So it's really going to come down to taste. Are you looking for something you can play in one sitting that isn't super heavy rules overhead, but still gives you a good feel for the period? I would maybe suggest something like Horse and Musket, or even the Via Victis system. I think both of those will give you a nice experience without getting too deep into the weeds, and you can finish it, in a couple hours, sometimes like 45 minutes, and sometimes for Horse and Musket scenarios. If you want something you can play with new gamers, something that you want to introduce someone to the period without burdening them with the sort of educational overhead of figuring out linear warfare, I do think that Camposanto is a great intro war game for players, for war gamers who maybe have only played Commands and Colors or something similar. Again, Horse and Musket is similar in that way as well, and you can make Horse and Musket more complex as you get more familiar with the system. There's tons of content for Horse and Musket as well, so even though we're starting sort of War of Spanish Succession, 9 Years' War, in this one there are plenty of expansions that add battles for all the way up through the American Civil War. That was kind of what it was designed to do. Camposanto is a great, a very affordable, if you can find a copy of the magazine, way to play a battle from the War of Austrian Succession with even kids, or young teenagers. And then obviously, if you want something that's more of a wargamers game, but it's not going to break the bank or take all day, this series, maybe not these 2 battles, but this series is one worth looking at. There's a ton of magazine issues that have 7 Years' War battles from this system. If you want something creative that's going to make you think differently, that is going to be unlike anything you've ever played, then Blenheim would be my go-to. You can probably finish this in one long sitting, but getting to grips with the rules is going to be a lot more challenging than any of these 3 because it asks you to unlearn a lot of what you have learned. On the more complex end, you've got 7 Years' War battle system and Piacenza. I don't recommend this right now. I think a lot of work needs to be done to smooth out this system, because even though there are things I like about it, there's plenty that I don't like. You can go watch my video about the playthrough I did of this, specifically around the usability of the components, which is going to make trying to learn the system and get into it much more difficult than it has to be. Piacenza has some novel concepts as well, and I think will be comfortable for more hardcore wargamers. This is going to be a long game, longer if you play the full scenario. There is a couple shorter scenarios, but if you play the full battle, probably going to be 1 or 2 sessions to complete it, depending on how fast you play. But I do think that for my money, if I had to pick only... if I only had to pick one of these, that would be difficult. Probably the one I would pick would probably be Horse and Musket, just because of how much content there is in the box, and I liked the system. But I think Piacenza would probably be, because it's only one battle. I think that's the only downside, is it's just the one battle. I know the designer's working on another game in this system, which hopefully will come out. But I think Piacenza, in terms of all of the stuff that we've talked about, all of the different aspects of linear warfare of the 18th century and all of that stuff, I think Piacenza is the most well-rounded game. And so I think maybe it's my favorite of the 6. Even though I like other parts of other games better. But I think this does a really good job. The designer, Enrico Acerbi, did a great job with the research and implementing that research into mechanics. It's not too burdensome, even though it is a crunchy war game. And once you get playing, it's actually pretty good in terms of like speed of play. So yeah. So for my money, Piacenza or Horse and Musket, depending on the context. But I like all of the other ones as well for different reasons, or different parts of the other ones. So anyways, thank you for joining me on this exploration. It's the first time I've kind of done anything like this. I do have some ideas for videos like this for other eras and other game types and systems. So if you'd like to see that, let me know if this was enjoyable to watch at all, or if it was just a bunch of nonsense, because it's kind of an experiment that I wanted to try. But that aside, if you've watched any of the playthrough videos I've done of these 6 games, I've spent the summer kind of exploring 18th century warfare. I really appreciate anyone who has watched and who has stuck with it as I've gone through the various European wars of this period. So yeah, hope this was helpful, and thanks very much.